Recently, I revisited I, Madman, which is a film that I think is underrepresented in conversation about the more of the supernatural slasher films. It's a film I think there's a lot more going on under the covers, but also just on the surface level of the screen than it ever gets credit for. Let me know if you'd like a more in-depth look at I, Madman for my thoughts on that, but that's not what this video is about. I want to talk about Candyman. Now, I don't want to talk about the character, and I don't want to talk about the sequels. Instead, what I want to do is take a look at the first film, not the novella it's based on, and not any of the other material, whether comic books or anything else that has come out subsequent. I'd want to take a look at that first film and really go under the hood to talk about what that film is about, because it's probably not a film that a lot of people have given the proper amount of study. And it's also not a film that really invites you to look too deep into it. You can tell from the storybook aspects of it that there's something more going on, but at the same rate, the story is so compelling and the film is so visually interesting that you're completely forgiven to take it as what it is, just a great supernatural slasher film. Here's the thing, though. It's not a slasher at all, and it's not supernatural at all. Stripped down to its basics, it's a very, very simple story, but it's told in the framework of a horror film. Candyman owes a lot to the cinema of Jacques Tourneur, and in particular Cat People, in that it tells a story on a storybook level that is meant to affect us on an entirely different level, which is more common to our real lives. And that's what horror does really well, better than any other genre, and which is, I believe, why it is the most emotional genre and most complex emotional genre that exists. I don't think anywhere else you can tell these type of stories because you simply don't have the vocabulary accessible when you're trying to be ultra realistic, or if there's very stagnant borders to your fantasy worlds. Horror has none of that. It's the floodgates are open. Whatever emotes, whatever gets to you is fair game. And Candyman is a great example of this. So what is Candyman? It's not the story of a guy with a hook for a hand, although that's important. In fact, it's not a story about race, although there's plenty of suggestion that it is about race. But that's really just a veneer that's laid over the film. Now, it does have some resonance and some importance too, don't get me wrong, but that's not what the movie is. The film is about Helen, a woman who's no longer the trophy wife of an academic. Now she's trying to make her own reputation. And she's trying to do that for a very specific reason. She feels that in her private life she's failing. So she's trying to make her professional life make up the difference. She's looking for a self-importance to hang on to. Her husband is pretty clearly losing interest. In fact, he's turning his attention to young students that are coming through his classrooms, and she's not unaware of this. She slowly begins to lose her grip on reality as she becomes immersed in her academic studies. Again, she's placed so much importance on those academic studies because her family life is pretty much collapsing. This brings her to Cabrini Green, which is a great environment because it perfectly matches her headspace. She looks at a world that's decaying, that is full of strife, and has all this simmering hostility. It's not about race, but it is about feeling like the whole world has been designed to keep you in your place, which is certainly what she feels. She wants to be her husband's equal because she believes that will keep the relationship alive and vital. Whether that's true or not is a whole different issue. And some people could say even, that kind of a mindset has a certain ring of sexism. But I don't think just because it shouldn't be how a lot of women feel, that it's not how a lot of women have felt historically. And Helen, I think, is exactly there. She's starting to age out of being motherhood material, right? She's a little bit too old to start the birthing process and raising a child. She'll be the older mom in the classroom during the PTA meetings, right? So she has a clock racing against her. So she goes to look for a mythological man, which is not at all a coincidence. So what is Candyman to her? Well, if you think about her husband, he kind of hooked her in with a promise of a life shared together and common experiences and love. But that's not what she's ended up getting. Think about when she finally does come face to face in a parking garage with Candyman, what does he say to her? Be my victim, which is kind of precisely what the husband has done up to this point in their relationship. Also, at a certain point, Candyman murders a mother and steals a baby. Or does he? Of course he doesn't. Of course this is Helen that did that. And that's what the police believe, and the police aren't wrong. We're very sympathetic to Helen because we like her as a person. We know she's a good person. But she's completely guilty of this crime. She completely killed a woman for her baby. Because, of course, it's what she's been denied. In the end, she sacrifices herself for that child because that's the only thing left in her life that has any import. It's not her baby, but she wishes it was. Now, at the very end of the film, Helen finally succumbs and becomes the monster that she didn't want to be. She didn't want to be the spurned ex-wife. She didn't want to be the petty, jealous ex-lover. She basically wanted to become that young student that her husband has taken on as a lover. But we already see that that young student's life is going down exactly the same path before, of course, she meets the bad end of a hook. Candyman is really a story about a woman looking down the barrel of society. Society has expectations for women. It categorizes women and their sexuality in a very specific way. And if you fall outside those lines even a little bit, well, the monsters come for you. And the monsters, of course, are rejection and age and dying a spinster. Now, all that is real-world concerns. The fact that Candyman effectively made horror film trappings crystallize that concept is why it's a great film. It's also why we relate to it so well. If this had just been a film about a guy with a hook for a hand that gets you in your dreams, well, that's Nightmare on Elm Street. I mean, isn't it? And the Nightmare on Elm Street films, for all of their value, or lack thereof in some cases, are really just horror films. They use the dream world as just a place to scare the characters and the audience. The nightmare sequences, or the surreal sequences of Candyman, are a clear indication that we are going into Helen's subconscious or her growing madness. And we're seeing the world through an elevated eye at that moment. And that's a very powerful, singular storytelling technique. Now, there are other films that have successfully done this as well, Paper House being one, which is not a big surprise, I guess, considering its authorship and pedigree. But I, Madman is another. Serpent in the Rainbow, which is interesting because there you have Wes Craven kind of using the dream logic world as a psychological tool, which is something he didn't do in Nightmare on Elm Street, which is his better-known film that would seem to be similar material. It's not, but it would seem to fit into that box. Candyman's score sounds like a music box or a children's toy, and that's very intentional. It is telling us that we're watching something that's just not true on its surface, is something deeper, as well as representing the childhood and mother-child theme that does go throughout the film. It's interesting to me that the sequels didn't take up this trend at all. They didn't bring Helen back. They didn't put another character in a similar situation. They portrayed Candyman as kind of a literal flesh and blood monster from the ages, a ghost, a specter, a spirit, a wraith. And that's not, I think, the power of the story, and that's why I think the second film, and especially the third film, don't work quite as well as the original. This is one of those rare series that is really hard to find people who champion one of the sequels as better than the original, and I think it is because there's so much detail to the storytelling in the original. It's just a friggin' great film that has something important to say. And what is it saying? Because that's what the movie's about, but what is the movie saying? The movie is a warning. It's a warning to women not to place your self-worth through the eyes of men. It is a warning to men to treat women with the respect they deserve. But it's also a wider social issue. And this is where it perfectly balances the issues of race. Not just in giving Helen an environment that meets her mindset, but also race is very much an uncontrollable. We're born in the skin we're born, right? And to a degree, it's what we can do beyond that, right, that define who we are. But in the case of all these characters. They are all kind of locked into what society feels that they have to do because of their positions. The movie is a tragedy, nearly in the Greek tradition, about how when we stop really being happy, when we stop fighting for what's important, when we stop protecting those who matter, we become the villain of our story. And that's Helen's journey. Now, I think that the movie also does something that doesn't really get discussed, and it's that it is pretty humorless. Most films at this time, from I'd say the release of Dream Warriors through Scream, maybe even to the end of the last slasher wave, I would say those movies have a lot of humor in them. And there was a need that all those films felt to relieve tension so they could build tension back up, which is something you hear a lot about. But while it works, it's kind of small potatoes as for storytelling goes. It's kind of like big amateur hour, beginner's night at the karaoke bar. Candyman never lets you breathe. It never brings you up for air. It never gives you that funny moment. And by not doing that, it makes all the socially important and personally important aspects of the film shine through and become really relevant and meaningful. At the end of this film, when Helen is dying from the burn wounds, she feels like King Kong in a way. Like, King Kong did some horrific things if you think about it, but at the core was a good being. Well, Helen didn't want to be in the position she ended up, and it is a tragedy that she ended there. Doesn't excuse anything she does. But I think that horror movies usually work best as tragedies. I think that happy endings should be rare and earned, and I think that this is a great example of a place where a happy ending would destroy everything the film represents. Anyway, hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you're not holding your breath for me to do the sequels in this series as storytelling autopsies, because that's simply not going to happen. If you do want to hear my thoughts on I, Madman or Bad Dreams or any of those other dream cycle horror films that I think actually thematically have more going on than the Nightmare on Elm Street sequels and remake, let me know. I would really consider doing those. If you show that you really want it, I'd be happy to oblige. Till next time.